Good evening, everyone. Well, I've already messed up the opening because I was on the wrong page. So I just want to thank you for joining us again this evening for our science lecture series in Centennial Hall. I'm Carmi Garzione, the Dean of the College of Science. We are always grateful to see you here to celebrate the sciences with us. And this year, our 2025 lecture series, our 20th year, is focused on Can We Talk? The Science of Communication. It's great to see so many of you in the audience with us tonight. We are deeply grateful for your support of the sciences and the University of Arizona. I would like to welcome our special guest for the evening, the Western Public Deans Conference, with numerous deans and associate deans in the audience from universities at public Western state universities. I'd also like to welcome the Galileo Circle members in the audience tonight, and thank you for your continued support of our students and faculty in the College of Science. I'd like to thank our corporate sponsors and media partners for the lecture series, in particular for our presenting series sponsors, Holua Loa Companies, the Marshall Foundation, Raytheon, and the Research Corporation for Science Advancement, as well as our series sponsors, O'Reilly Chevrolet, Tech Launch Arizona, TMC Health, Tucson Electric Power, and Visit Tucson. And our media partners, the BizSuit Tucson Magazine and Cox Communication. I would also like to thank Arizona Arts Live for your continued support in helping us to bring this lecture series to life every year in Centennial Hall. There are many ways that people share their thoughts, their ideas, their feelings, and their discoveries with audiences. In the spirit of reaching audiences through a diverse platform for communication, I'm really pleased to share that the College of Science continues to partner with the Poetry Center to bring an alternative perspective of the sciences to our audience. So the University of Arizona Poetry Center connects us with a poet each year, and before each lecture, a poet reads an original piece that is crafted for the evening's talk. And so tonight's poet is Susan Briante, who is a professor of English and creative writing at the University of Arizona. And Susan is the author of Defacing the Monument, winner of the Poetry Foundation's Pegasus Award. We are delighted to have her with us tonight. Susan, would you please join me on the stage?
Thank you so much for that introduction. It's really lovely to be here this evening, bringing a little poetry into the space before a talk that I'm excited to hear. I thought it would be appropriate before a talk that has to deal with recognizing emotions and human and computer communications to share a poem that came from my experiences and experiments with how systems can influence poems. So in the case of the excerpt from a poem I'm going to read, this came out of an experiment that I conducted a few years ago on how the stock market could teach and influence my poetry. I will mention the names of two poets in the first stanza of the poem. John Ashbery and Lynn Heginian. Do not worry about them. You will not be tested at the end. And I will also mention that this is a poem that was written, the book was written in response to the 2008 financial crisis. And throughout the book, there are poems that record the closing number of the Dow Jones Industrial Average, which this poem does, but it was written in, I think, 2010. So when I read that closing number, do not panic. It is an old number. Do not feel any worse than you probably already do following the Dow. This is from a longer poem, an excerpt from a longer poem called Towards a Poetics of the Dow. Every day has a number attached to it, great additions, subtractions. This is not just an aesthetic problem, see Ashbery. There is a natural impulse towards closure, A bell rings, trading stops, but the world is unfinished. Hygenian. Both the rivers and their banks are moving. The poem remains incomplete, the trading day long over. I do not believe if I follow the Tao, I will find nirvana, but I often check the numbers and sit for meditation. When we think we are at the end, there are decimals. When the Buddha touched his finger to the ground at the moment of enlightenment, all the leaves fell from the Bodhi tree. It's February 10th, 10:04 in the morning. The Tao falls to 12,194. The present poetic strives towards total awareness, incessant recording. Ravenous as a black walnut tree, roots sucking at the sore line, the Tao touches everything. The taste of our water, the color of our sky, torque of our engines. It's February 10th, 10:15 in the morning. The Tao at 12,203 is rising. The poet, like the trash tree, uses all of it. A poem moves as does the Tao, influenced by a variety of factors and events, mergers, oil spills, revolutions, suffering. Sometimes what does not move tells the story. I like poems that go to prison and coal mining town. I like poems that act as an archive or a view to Elizabeth Street. I admire circuitry and cosmology. I write with a power industry dictionary on the bookshelf behind my desk, a copy of the King James, a guide to Texas trees. Poems should evidence some degree of control, but poets should be a little volatile. The poem is a high-risk investment, a long-term commitment. Like a big, dirty city, it should make you feel a little uncomfortable. It's February 10th, 1:11 in the afternoon. The Tao falls to 12,197. The poet wants to remind the Tao that the bird has something to teach it about falling and song. Thank you.
Just want to thank Susan again for that reading. It definitely sets the stage for tonight's talk. I would now like to introduce tonight's speaker, Dr. Ellen Riloff. Dr. Riloff is a professor and the department head of computer science at the University of Arizona. And prior to arriving in Tucson, Ellen was a professor at the Callert School of Computing at the University of Utah. Dr. Riloff's primary research area is natural language processing with an emphasis on information extraction, effective text analysis, semantics, and common sense knowledge acquisition. A major emphasis of her research has been on automatically acquiring the knowledge needed for natural language processing using bootstrap methods that can learn from unannotated texts with minimal human supervision. Dr. Riloff has served as general chair and program co-chair for major national language processing conferences, served as the NAACL executive board, served on the Computational Linguistics Editorial Board and the Transactions of the Association for Computational Linguistics Editorial Board. And in 2018, she was named a fellow of the Association for Computational Linguistics. Without further ado, I'd like to ask Ellen to please join the stage for her presentation.
Thank you. Hi, everybody. Thank you for coming out to the lecture series talk today. I thought I would begin my talk with a cartoon, both because I like humor and also because there's often a lot of truth in humor. And in this case, the truth is that for a long time, our computers did not really care about what we felt. And that's largely because we viewed them as number crunching devices or devices that accomplished routine tasks for us. But these days, our computers are integrated more and more into our society. We engage with them directly every single day. And so I'm going to talk today about why I think it's important that we design our computers to have emotional intelligence going forward. So this is a roadmap for my talk today. I'll start off by talking about why I think it's important for that computers can recognize emotions. I'll then talk about why it's surprisingly difficult to get our computers to understand our emotions. Then I'll talk a little bit about the research that's going on in the field of human language understanding, which is my own research area, and I'll talk a little bit about some of my research in that area. And finally, I'll wrap up with some of the challenges that remain for the future. So, conversation. We talk to our devices a lot these days, whether it's talking into a smartphone using an app like Siri, or this little girl here is using a personal assistant at home, Amazon's Alexa voice assistant, or the person on the right-hand side here is talking to a virtual agent. In this case, it's an avatar produced by NVIDIA. We also talk to virtual agents online through the keyboard, where we type in our conversations and talk to them that way. And there's also an exciting area of AI called social robotics, so I wanted to touch on that briefly. The idea here is that we design robots not just to tackle important tasks for us, but also to be social companions. And so this is an example of a little social robot that was designed by some researchers at the MIT Media Lab. And the goal behind this little robot, once you first of all put it in a cute little furry suit, so it kind of looks like a Muppet, and then you can put it in the classroom alongside children to help them learn. So the hypothesis is that children will learn better when they're not learning by themselves, but they're learning alongside a companion. So the robot in this case is not teaching them things per se, but just learning alongside them to encourage them. So if the child answers something correctly on a quiz, the robot can get all excited and say, "Congratulations, I'm so proud of you," and make the child feel good about having learned. Or on the other hand, if the child struggles and gets a question wrong, then the robot can kind of empathize with the child and say, "Oh, that really was a hard one. I would have gotten it wrong too," and encourage the child to keep going, and you'll get the next one right, don't worry. So there's a lot of work in this general space. Other examples of this are people who are doing a lot of work on developing AI agents to help with different kinds of therapies. And the idea here is that sometimes people are more comfortable opening up to some sort of a robot or computing device than they are other real people. Or autistic children, for example, sometimes respond better to computers or computing devices than they do to other people or even puppets. So there's a lot of opportunities here for social robots. Another application for these is to help people who are suffering from social isolation. There is an epidemic of this in the country. I think the estimate is that something like 1 in 4 people over the age of 65 is socially isolated. So we can imagine putting some sort of a robot in the home with them so that they can communicate with this person, which can help with mental health concerns that we might have in these situations, and also help accomplish small tasks, especially for people who might be mobility impaired. And if you're a dog lover, there are also robot dogs designed for companionship. This is an actual robot dog produced by Sony named Aibo. And so if you were at the lecture series talk 2 weeks ago, we talked about human-dog communication. This might be an example of human-dog-robot communication, I guess. And there's also a company that has produced a robotic cat. Although I don't think the cat needs emotional intelligence, because the company itself says that it was designed to be like a real cat and it's going to do whatever it wants, right? So, so why do these systems need to have emotional intelligence? One reason is that we want to make sure that the conversations that they have are appropriate and not insensitive. So for example, if I'm talking to Siri or any sort of computing device, and I say, "I'm feeling depressed today," and Siri responds and says, "That's wonderful," right? I'm going to view Siri at the very least being insensitive, possibly obnoxious, and in some cases I might feel insulted or even mocked, right? So sometimes if you have an inappropriate response from a device, it can actually make things worse. We certainly don't want these kinds of interactions. And this is not a hypothetical concern. This is an example that was floating around on social media for a while, where somebody was interacting with PayPal's virtual agent and told the agent, "I got scammed." And PayPal said, "Great." So I don't know about you, but I'm not going to want to keep interacting with a virtual agent who think it's good to be scammed, right? Another example that was floating around social media for a while is this video. This woman was in a hospital taking care of a loved one who was ill. A hospital robot walked up to her and asked if she wanted to hear a joke. She did not, and she got pretty upset, as you might imagine, and proceeded to try to beat up the robot. So again, we definitely don't want to have inappropriate interactions that anger people, or certainly not make them so angry that they turn violent. Another way that we communicate with our computers is through written communication, and there's a lot of ways in which we communicate with other people through our devices. We'd really like for our computers to have the ability to read what we've written in communication with other people or directly to the agent. So for example, social media. There's many different social media platforms where we exchange information with each other. We'd like the computers to be able to read what people are talking about on social media. One example of why this is important is first responders. First responders turn to social media during natural disasters to keep track of what's happening during a natural disaster in real time. That's the first place they'll often learn about where things are actually flooding, for example, in a hurricane, or where a road might be blocked, or where a bridge might be down. In earthquakes, social media is the first place that the shaking is reported, and so on and so forth. So we like our computers to be able to scan social media and understand what's happening too. Newspapers are, of course, another mechanism by which we communicate with each other. Global events of major importance are often communicated through different news media outlets. We'd like our computers to be able to read these newspapers and information too, to keep up with what's happening in the world. Whether it's a disease outbreak that's starting up someplace in the world, whether it's a plane crash, whether it's a terrorist event. There's too much news being printed every hour for humans to keep up with themselves. We'd like the computer to be able to read all this information and notify the authorities when something is going on anywhere around the world, and also notify the public. And then in science, what do scientists do? Well, scientists do experiments, and then what happens? We write up the results of our experiments in journal articles or conference papers and abstracts. Okay, so the results of our science first is expressed in human language. There is way too much literature being written every single day for researchers to keep up with. So we'd love to have a computer who can read all the latest scientific results and then curate that information to tell the researchers in the field what's happening on a daily basis, new discoveries that might be relevant to their own work, or also to curate the information and put it into scientific databases. So let's get back to emotion for a minute. Another place where we communicate with each other online is through online reviews. Okay, so many of us, when we are about to purchase something expensive, like a computer or a car, we'll go online to see what other people say about different models that we might be considering. And we often express our views as being sort of positive or negative, and also provide more details in some cases. We do this for restaurants to decide what restaurant to go to, what hotel to stay at, what movie to see, what book to read, and so on. So sometimes these reviews come with explicit ratings. Might be a thumbs up or a thumbs down. Might be a specific number of stars. Might be an emoticon. But that's not always the case, as I'll show you in a minute. So let's take a look at some reviews. These are reviews of the Grand Canyon. So Lisa Simpson here gives the Grand Canyon 5 stars. She says, I visited the Grand Canyon last week, and it was absolutely stunning, as always. The breathtaking canyons carved by the Colorado River never fail to amaze me. Okay, so that's a pretty good review. Bart, on the other hand, was much less impressed. He gave the Grand Canyon only 1 review, 1 star. He said, I went to the Grand Canyon this past week. There was dirt everywhere, and the hiking trail was too long. Also, where are the vending machines? Okay. So very different opinions of the Grand Canyon here. These are real reviews, by the way, although obviously not written by Lisa and Bart Simpson. So in these cases, we have explicit rating, number of stars that the humans gave it. But there are lots of times where people express their opinions in open comment sections, or again in conversation, where we don't have an explicit rating. And we'd like the computer to be able to go in and determine automatically whether it's a positive and negative review and why. So in that case, here's the perspective that the computer has, just the human language. And the goal is that the computer can read Lisa's review and decide that, yeah, this is a really positive review, probably deserves 5 stars. In this case, it's pretty easy because we've got these strong terms like breathtaking and stunning, never ceases to amaze me. That's actually a double negative. I'll come back to that later. But for the most part, that's a pretty easy one for the computer to understand. Bart's, however, is really challenging. Right? The negative comments here are not emotional statements, but the fact that there's dirt everywhere, right? Or that the hiking trail is too long, which long hiking trails might be good to someone else, or just this question about not enough vending machines, right? But ultimately, we'd like the computer to be able to understand that that's a negative review as well. So here's a review, if you will, spoken by Fluffy the cat. And Fluffy is very happy with the food that she has in her environment, but less happy about the service. It is too slow. And Fluffy makes a really important point here that most reviews are not just 1 stars and 5 stars where everything is positive or everything is negative. Most reviews are a mixture. They might have 3 or 4 stars, for example, and the user might have things they like about the product or service and other things that they don't like. We'd really like the computer to be able to summarize what it is that the person likes and dislikes along with giving it an overall rating. So I'll tell you another reason why this is important. This is a true story from my own life. Some years ago, I was moving to California for a year, and I needed to rent an apartment. So I went online, started looking at different apartment complexes in the neighborhood where I wanted to live, and I found 2 of them that looked really good, and overall they had a high rating, about 4.5 stars each, and I wasn't sure which one to pick. So each of them had some negative reviews, so I started reading them. And the first apartment complex, there was a common thread among the negative reviews, which was dishonest property managers. People were claiming they got overcharged or they didn't get their security deposit refunded. That didn't make me happy. So I said, let's check out the other apartment complex. I read the negative reviews for that one, and there was a common thread there too, which was mostly that there were a lot of dogs there. Too many dogs, and they are constantly barking. So I thought to myself, I have a dog. My dog constantly barks too. These are my people, right? I'll fit in really well here. And so I proceeded to rent that apartment complex. But the moral to that story is that different things matter to different people. So we really need the computer, again, to not just give ratings, but to understand the language and extract out the details of what people like and what people don't like. Okay, so that's the first part of my part. Hopefully you're convinced now that it's important to recognize emotions. There are other reasons as well, of course. I want to talk now about why it's so challenging to get our computers to recognize emotions. When you think about this task, you might think about keywords. There are a lot of clear emotion terms. We can go searching for love and hate and happy and sad, and if we find a sentence that contains those words, assume that this is probably expressing an emotion, and a lot of the times it is. But there's a lot of problems with this approach. It's a little too simple to be accurate. One of the reasons, as Rover has discovered here, is that there's a lot of different ways to express an emotion. Tons of ways. So I have just a small sample here of many different words that can express an emotion. We have compiled lists of these things, both manually, and there's some computational methods that have generated lists of these. There's thousands and thousands of them. And they're never complete. New words are always entering our vocabulary. And then there are also multi-word phrases, right, where the individual words may not express an emotion, but together the phrase as a whole does. So if I say I did something by following my heart, that means I felt good about it. If I'm on cloud 9 or over the moon, those are overall emotion expressions. If I say that you're driving me up a wall or driving me crazy, or that I see red over something, then I'm expressing a negative feeling. And these expressions, there's many of them, and they tend not to translate well across languages. So again, in a previous lecture series talk last week, we learned how many people speak multiple languages. Well, ultimately, we want our computers to understand multiple languages too, and this is one of the big challenges. There often need to be separate lists of phrases for the different language, because unlike individual words, these phrases just don't translate very well. There's also a tremendous amount of ambiguity. Some of it's based on context. So joy and hope, seem like really obvious emotion terms, and they are, but they're also common person names. So if I use joy and hope as keywords, I'm probably going to find a lot of sentences that refer to these people and other people with these names. Emotion terms can also be common last names. So Bob Hope, for example, is a very famous comedian. Kevin Love is a famous basketball player. And Love is a very common last name. There are lots of people with this last name, Love. Okay, so another reason why just using these terms as keywords is going to produce a lot of false hits. There are also movies, TV shows, books, video games. They can all contain emotion terms. When I refer to one of these things, it doesn't always mean I'm experiencing the emotion. In fact, I can be experiencing the opposite emotion. I might say, I love the show Mad Men, right? And that's overall a positive statement. And a lot of words, most words in fact, have multiple meanings. Okay, so the sign says fine for parking, and the guy says, I thought the sign meant it was okay to park here, right? This is, the fact that a word has multiple meanings is the rule, not the exception. They're actually relatively uncommon to find words that can only ever have a single meaning. So when we see a word like fine, we have to look at the context to determine whether it's an emotion or referring to, in this case, a monetary fee. Okay, let me talk about negation for a minute and polarity. So we really want our systems not just to recognize whether there is an emotion or not, but also what we call the polarity of the emotion, whether it's a positive feeling or a negative feeling. And with negation, the polarity flips. So the word pain is usually a negative word. We don't like experiencing pain. But if I say that I had no pain from this procedure, now that's a good thing. And there are many ways to express negation. It's not just the words no and not. I can say there was zero pain from the procedure, or little pain, or I was without pain, there was a lack of pain. Or verbs, something stopped the pain or eased the pain. All of these are negated expressions that are actually good things. Or I can use double negation. I can say something failed to ease the pain, and now there's still pain, so it's negative again. Or I can put another negation in front and say something never fails to ease the pain, okay, and now it's good. It eased the pain. And these are not sort of intellectual, esoteric examples. This kind of thing is really common. It's everywhere. Okay, so we need our systems, when they look at one of these keywords, to look at the full context and recognize whether there's negation in play here. So let's talk about sarcasm for a minute. These are 4 examples of sarcastic social media posts. We found them by using the sarcasm hashtag, but of course in real life you don't always have hashtags, right? Oh, how I love being ignored. I so love working on Saturday. Absolutely adore it when my bus is late. Thoroughly enjoyed shoveling the driveway today. Okay. All of us as humans would read these as negative statements, right? But if you look at it from the computer's perspective, they contain these really strong positive emotions. Love, adore, enjoyed. All right? The computer's going to look at these at first glance and say, they sound pretty positive to me. So why do, as humans, we view them as sarcastic? That's because these positive emotion terms are immediately followed by a negative event. Okay? Being ignored. It's pretty universal. Nobody likes being ignored. Okay? So when somebody says they love being ignored, it's the juxtaposition of those things, that contrast, that the sarcasm arises from. Okay, working on Saturdays. There's probably somebody out here who likes working on Saturdays, but most people prefer not to work on weekends. It's a stereotypically negative event. When your bus is late, shoveling snow out of your driveway, these are usually negative events. When they're preceded by a positive emotion term, it's almost always intended to be sarcastic. By the way, this also gives you a recipe to be sarcastic if you want to be. All you have to do is take a positive emotion term like love and follow it with a stereotypically negative event. I just love having root canals, right? Or I can't wait to clean the toilet. It's very easy to be sarcastic if you want to be. Okay, so how do we get the computer to recognize those particular instances of sarcasm. And by the way, sarcasm is a really broad phenomenon. That's not the only kind. But in that particular case, we have, again, an emotion term that's positive. We can recognize those with our lists. But how do we recognize those negative events? Well, as of maybe 10 years ago, we really didn't have computer systems that could do that. And so I embarked on this research agenda to try to build computational models to recognize what I call affective events. And these are events where something happens in the world, kind of an objective fact, but when it happens, the person experiencing the event is usually affected in a positive or negative way. So a positive event is events that happen and they're desirable or beneficial for people. Negative events are events that when they happen, they're undesirable or detrimental for people. So examples here, positive events are I will graduate from UA this spring, right? Most people are happy about that. Or I just adopted a new puppy, or I got engaged. Negative events might be things like your house burning down, your puppy running away, or breaking your arm. And we need our computers to be able to recognize not just the facts of what literally happened here, but also how people are affected by these events, to recognize sarcasm, as I just showed you, but also just to have appropriate conversations. Right? So if I'm talking to my device and I say, my house just burned down, and Siri says, that's wonderful, right? That's an inappropriate response. We're not going to be very happy with our agent. We would prefer for our computing devices to communicate with us like we do with other people. Another person would respond by saying, I'm really sorry to hear that. Is there anything I can do to help? Okay, so we need our computers to have that same emotional intelligence. Okay, so those are some of the reasons why recognizing emotions are pretty challenging for computers. In the next part of my talk, I want to talk about research in the area of human language understanding and present you with some history about that as well. Here's the background. I'm sure you've all heard of artificial intelligence these days, AI. This is traditionally a sub-area of computer science. There's many other areas of computer science as well. AI is not new. It was first, that term was created and those research agendas started in the 1950s, actually. It's something called the Dartmouth Conference. And there are other disciplines to tie in with AI as well. In particular, math plays a big role in a lot of AI systems, and also psychology and cognitive science. Within the field of AI, there's many sub-disciplines. One of the most prominent ones that you may have heard of is machine learning. That's also not new, even though it's in the news a lot today. The earliest machine learning systems were built in the 1950s as well. The term machine learning was coined by this man named Arthur Samuel, who was a researcher at IBM, who did work in the 1950s where he built a computer program to play checkers. And it not only played checkers, but it learned how to improve its checkers playing ability over time. A lot of the earliest ideas about machine learning came from him, and they're still the basis for a lot of our algorithms today. The field that I work in is called natural language processing, and these are about building computational models to understand human language. This is a separate discipline from machine learning, but these days we use a lot of machine learning tools as well, and so there's some overlap in these disciplines. So in the early days when we build our AI systems, we would usually do it by hand. There were teams of people who'd get together and write rules for how to solve problems that they cared about. When I was a grad student, that's how I spent many of my graduate student days, writing lots of rules by hand to get the system to understand language. And then in the 1990s or so, there was a statistical revolution in the field. That was around the time that the World Wide Web came about. And all of a sudden, we had tons of data at our fingertips. All of a sudden, there was all sorts of language available online in electronic text, whether it was web pages or newspaper archives or even books that were becoming available electronically, and so on. And so the first thing we started to do is use statistics to learn about common correlations between words and the contexts in which they occurred. And that produced some really big improvements in our systems. These systems that were trained with statistics were much more robust, much less brittle than the systems that had been designed with manually by teams of people. But they generally performed better, but they also were a little bit coarse, just looking at kind of associations between things. And sometimes you'd find statistical artifacts that could be a little surprising. So this is another true story from my own work. Many years ago, I was developing a system to learn words that were associated with emotions, and the system came back and said, eyebrows, that's an emotion. And I said, what? No, it's not, right? So think for a minute as to why the computer may have thought that the word eyebrows is an emotion. It's the expression raising your eyebrows. Okay, that's a really common expression that is associated with an emotion. So the computer was seeing that phrase a lot. And importantly, it wasn't seeing the word eyebrows in many other contexts. Okay, we just don't talk about our eyebrows very much. I mean, I don't know about you, but I don't walk around having conversations like, how are your eyebrows today? Mine are fine. How are yours? Oh, they're fine too, right? And so when you see the word eyebrows in ordinary discussion, it's almost always in the context of that phrase, raising your eyebrows, which is an emotional context. So that can be useful association in some applications, but on the other hand, you don't want to have eyebrows on your list of emotion words, right? So shortly after the statistical revolution, our language processing community started using machine learning algorithms. Again, they weren't new, but all of a sudden we had all this online data that we never had before. So it was an opportunity to start using these algorithms in a brand new way. We would get lots of online text, and then for whatever problem we wanted to solve, we'd ask people to label some examples for us. So if I wanted to build a system to recognize emotions, I might ask some people to label sentences that mentioned emotions. And then I'd give those to the machine learning algorithm, and it would build an AI model that could read sentences and identify the ones that mentioned an emotion. And these algorithms generally worked better than the more general statistical algorithms that preceded it because they were trained with examples from people for a specific task. That brings us to the current age, and we all still use machine learning heavily today. You've probably heard a lot about deep learning, which is just one type of machine learning algorithm. It's neural network architectures, if you haven't heard about that. And the real advantage of those algorithms is that they can absorb much more data than many of the algorithms before. And so it's that ability to just encapsulate massive amount of data that really give them their power. And one of the things we've been able to do with these deep learning models in the field of language processing is build these things called large language models that you've also may have heard about. And these things ingest, again, just a ton of real language use. Some of the biggest models can ingest over 1 trillion words of actual language use. And then we push it through one of these machine learning algorithms, a deep learning model, and they are really just trained to predict the next word. I'm simplifying things a little bit, but that's the heart of these models. They just consume lots and lots of word sequences and kind of learn what word sequences are common, what sort of context these words occur on. It's kind of like a statistical association method on steroids, right? And it just encapsulates it in this large language model. And then what do we do with the large language model? We can then use it to solve other problems. Okay, but let me give you an example first of why these word prediction models are so powerful. This is just it's a little simplistic, but just to give you the intuition. These models are essentially predicting the next word, almost like you would finish somebody else's sentence. Okay, so if I give you this sentence, old movies were filmed in black and blank, probably most of you are thinking black and white, right? But if I give you this sentence, and I say I fell down and my knee is black and blank, you're probably thinking black and blue. Okay, or if I say bumblebees are black and blank, you're probably thinking yellow. Well, large language models can solve these fill-in-the-blank things really, really well. And that can give them the illusion that they're doing something a lot more intelligent and using knowledge and reasoning than they really are. These models are not reasoning through all their understanding of old movies to answer this question. They're not accessing all this knowledge about bumblebees to answer this question. They just know which colors tend to appear in those contexts the most, which is very valuable and allows them to answer these questions really well but it's based on a fairly simple principle at its core. Okay, so once we've got one of these large language models that, again, has absorbed a massive amount of language, we can build systems on top of that to solve very specific problems. So suppose I want to build an emotion recognizer. I want to build a system that can take a sentence and determine whether there's an emotion in that sentence. I can start now with the large language model and use machine learning on top of that. So before, 10 years ago, I would have started with machine learning and just some examples provided by a human, and that would have been a blank slate. I would have been learning from scratch. Now I'm starting with all of the knowledge about language that the large language model has ingested and learning to solve this particular problem as sort of a specific variation on language in general. I give a few examples, and the system is fine-tuned, as we say, to solve this particular problem using both the examples plus all this general knowledge of the English language that has been absorbed by the large language model. So some years ago, I was working on this problem of trying to identify these events that are typically positive or negative affective events. And I'd been working on it in some small ways. In about 2018, one of my graduate students and I developed this model that was bigger and badder than the previous ones. Could learn 175,000 of these event phrases with performance of about 66%, which was better than the previous performance. So it wasn't a solved problem, but it was a nice boost in performance, and we had a lot of these event phrases. A few years later, these large language models came about, and we thought, I wonder how well they can do. Can they really help us do better at this task? So we trained up a deep learning model on top of a large language model and instantly got 75.7% performance. So in the space of a few years, we were able to get almost 10 points more performance because we had these large language models to build the method on top of. There's another trick we can do in language processing, and I do this a lot in my own research, and that's called bootstrap learning. So the idea is just like that phrase, pulling yourself up by your own bootstraps, where you build an initial system that maybe can't solve a problem perfectly, but it can solve some instances of the problem. And so once you build it, you can then use it to go find more examples, and with a few little tricks and heuristic, label more examples automatically, and then retrain the system using the examples that it itself generated. Again, there's some tricks kind of in the middle of it, but that's the basic idea. So this loop at the bottom is the new part, where the system is gradually improving itself over several iterations. And let me give you the intuition behind that. Suppose I want to determine whether riding a horse is generally a good thing or bad thing to people. I might go look for sentences that mention riding a horse and look to see what emotions were expressed afterwards. Okay, so in this case, I found 4 sentences, and 3 of them had positive emotions expressed. That was fun, I had a great time, or what a thrill. 1 of them, not so much, the horse smelled terrible. But we might take a leap of faith here and say, well, 3 of the 4 people liked riding a horse, maybe look at some other cases as well, and then assume that in general this is probably a positive activity. We label it automatically, give it back to the system as a new example, and the system can learn some more based on this new example. And so we added a bootstrap learning component on top of that previous model to recognize these event phrases, and we got another 3, a little over 3 more points of performance, up to 79%. So in the space of a relatively short period of time, we were able to go from about 66% performance to 79% performance on this task, in large part because of deep learning models and large language models, and also a little bootstrapping on top. Okay, so that brings me to the 4th part of my talk, where I want to talk about some of the challenges that remain for the future. And I think a lot of these problems are really exciting. There's a lot of fun work to be done in this space. And one of the points I want to make early on, too, is I've been talking about these affective events, these positive or negative events, in the context of recognizing emotions. Okay. But really, they are essential to nearly all human communication, not only recognizing emotions. When we communicate with each other, whether it's through conversation, whether it's through writing in books or even in newspaper articles, any sort of narrative text where we're talking about events that happen to us in the world, we largely focus on problems. We talk about problems that we have. We try to work through how we might fix those problems, resolve them, and then hopefully they do get resolved and we achieve our goals. So an awful lot of human communication is focused on these three things: problems, thinking about them and trying to figure out how to move forward, and then finding a solution. Well, what's a problem? It's a negative event. So any sort of event that's undesirable or detrimental to you, that's a problem. Now, we can't solve all problems, but for many of those situations, we try, right? We try to improve our situation and find a way forward. So then we plan, try to figure out how we might solve the problem, and then we talk about the solutions with each other, what worked and what didn't work. Hopefully, if we were able to resolve the problem and achieve our goals, then that's a positive event. So a lot of story understanding and just human communication revolves around these affective events, even when it just looks like a discussion of events. So let me show you an example of what I mean. I spent some time reading through Aesop's fables. Some of you may have read them as a child. They're these short little stories that have a lot of animal characters in them, sometimes people too, and they often have a moral at the end. So you may remember one about the fox and the grapes and the sour grapes, and that's where it comes from. There's one called The Ant and the Dove. This is a summary of that fable. In this story, there's a dove who sees an ant fall into a brook, and it's struggling. The dove drops a blade of straw near it, and the ant floats safely to shore. A little while later, the ant sees a man ready to kill the dove. The ant stings him, and the man misses. The dove is then able to fly to safety. Okay, so if you look at this language here, there's no emotion in it at all, right? Just facts, just events that happened in the world. But the way humans would understand it would look something like this. So this is the way we want the computers to understand it too. The first part, focusing on the ant's perspective, the ant has a problem, right? The ant's in a bad situation. It fell into the brook and it's struggling. Then the second sentence describes how the dove tries to help the ant, lends a helping hand, or I guess in this case a helping foot, I'm not sure, right? And then the ant is able to float to safety. So that's a positive event. What we have here is a negative event, and then a helping hand or helping foot, and then a positive event. And I'm not claiming that the ant is like jumping up and down in celebration, necessarily experiencing emotions, but this is a description of the state of the ant's world, its situation. The second part of the story, we can focus on the dove's situation. And initially, the dove's in a bad state because the man's getting ready to kill him. The ant lends a helping hand or a helping foot, okay? And then the dove is able to fly away to safety. So again, the dove starts in a bad situation, is helped by the ant, and then ends up in a positive situation. And that's really how we understand the story. It's not just the facts, literally, it's also how the characters were affected by these events. And a key part of the story is recognizing the symmetry between the events happening to the ant and the events happening to the dove, and that's where the moral comes in. You help me, and I'll help you. Okay, so these affective events, recognizing the emotions or feelings or states of characters when events happen is absolutely critical to our understanding of stories and conversations and pretty much all of our communication. So there's a lot of work to be done to incorporate these affective events into just every type of communication, really. Another challenge that our computers have is world knowledge and common sense. Humans make an awful lot of inferences when we have conversations with each other. So if I walk up to a colleague and I say, my office is like Antarctica, first of all, they're going to assume I'm not happy about that. Okay? I didn't say anything about my emotions, but they would infer I'm in a negative state here. Furthermore, they'd assume that my office is cold. I didn't say that, right? But as humans, we share knowledge about Antarctica, and we would infer that my office is cold, and I'm not happy about that. I'll just note, too, there are other inferences one could make, like Antarctica is really far away. I wasn't saying that my office is really far away. Antarctica is mostly white. I wasn't saying my office is painted white. So why we infer cold and not some of these other properties is also an interesting question. There are also embodied emotions. We make a lot of movements and gestures that betray our emotions, sometimes voluntarily, sometimes involuntarily. So Donald Duck here is kind of impatient, right? He's in a negative state, and you can see that with the foot tapping. This pug from Disney is rolling his eyes, which suggests he's not happy about whatever is being said to him. Rover, on the other hand, with the shades, has a really positive relationship with the robot, and they're fist bumping each other. There are a ton of these physical movements that we make that reflect the emotions that we're feeling, and we need our computers to be able to recognize them. And humans aren't the only creatures that have embodied emotions. Tail wagging is an embodied emotion for dogs, right? So when the tail wags, that means they're happy, and that's why dogs don't play poker. So in the end, we really need our AI systems in order to recognize emotions to be looking at many different things, not just the language. So the language is one element. Sometimes we just talk about someone else's physical reaction. So I might just say that Julie rolled her eyes when I told her of the idea, and you would then infer that she didn't like the idea. We also have voice. I'm speaking today, my voice is going up and down. There's a lot of clues in the intonations that we use. I don't do that research myself, but there's a lot of other researchers who do, and that's another important clue to recognizing emotions. And of course, there's facial recognition and gesture recognition. And there are computer vision systems. This is another area of artificial intelligence. People who work in computer vision are trying to solve these problems, recognizing our facial expressions and how they may correlate with emotions, or gestures like the hands in the air, or the dreaded finger wag, right? There's also the issue of perspective. This is really, really key, right? The emotion that you're feeling depends on your perspective with respect to an event. So as humans, I think most of us viewed the movie Titanic as being a sad kind of movie. But if you're a shark, Titanic has a very happy ending. So we can't ignore this. This was also part of the ant and dove story. The emotions depend on your perspective in many cases. Okay, so to kind of wrap up my talk, I think there is a ton of potential in our computing devices going forward, all sorts of virtual agents and intelligent systems that we may be using in the future. They can help us in our everyday lives in many, many different ways and help us make new scientific discoveries and breakthroughs as well. But we really need our systems to have emotional intelligence as well as just problem-solving capabilities. We need that so that they can understand us, communicate with us accurately. We need it so that they can recognize our needs and our wants. We need it so they can act appropriately and not be insulting or mocking, and also that they can be engaging with us so that we find the conversations to be interesting and relevant and ultimately productive. So I'll leave you with one last cartoon, which is my goal for the future. I hope that the next generation of systems will have heart and have some emotional intelligence built into them. So I'll end my talk there, but thank you very much for your time today.
So I just want to thank Ellen again for that fantastic talk. I think it's important to understand why computers need to understand our emotions, as well as to understand the ways that computer scientists are really pushing the envelope and enabling computers to do more tasks for us. So I'm going to invite you all up in a moment, for those who have a question for Ellen, to come up to the corner of the stage. She will be rejoining us to answer any of your questions. But before we do that, I would like to invite you all to next Thursday's lecture, which will be featuring Daniel Apai and Dr. Chris Impey. And this will be the fourth and final lecture in our series. And we're going to hear from both Dr. Apai and Dr. Impey what their talk will be about.
Hello, I'm Daniel Pai.
And I'm Chris Impey, and we'd like to invite you to Centennial Hall next Thursday for the final lecture in the 2025 College of Science Lecture Series.
In our lecture, we'll dive into one of the most exciting questions in science. Could we ever communicate with extraterrestrial civilizations?
We'll explore if it's even possible to exchange messages with alien life, and how we might go about doing that. But it's not just about technology. What could or should we convey in these messages?
We'll also look at who might be receiving these signals. What can these potential recipients teach us about our own civilization's future?
And finally, should we be cautious, or should we boldly send out our own messages, taking a more active role?
We hope to see you there.
So we hope you will join us next week for our final lecture. When you head out this evening, if you'd like to learn a little bit more about the Galileo Circle, please visit our table in the lobby to connect with our development and alumni team, or simply to grab a brochure and get some College of Science goodies. Please get home safely. We look forward to seeing you next week, and welcome to come on up to the stage to talk with Ellen if you have some questions. Thank you all for joining us.